Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia marked the beginning of a new era. How will the war in Ukraine change the world? Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce. Thank you.
The Russian invasion on February 24 was the start of the largest land war that we have seen in Europe since World War II. Is territorial conquest back on the agenda?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it's no doubt about it that the Ukraine invasion is a defining moment in the evolution of the international transition that we've been living through, I think, since the end of the Cold War. There's a number of points I'd like to make. I think, firstly, with regard to territorial annexation, the failure of Russia to decapitate the regime in Kyiv, which was the intention, we now know through the Ukrainian intelligence services capturing documents for parts of Ukraine that they've reoccupied, having driven the Russians back to the eastern part of the country, that the plans were definitely in place to take over the whole country and put in a pro-Russian government, which is actually quite delusional because Russia's economy is smaller than it is. It's about 11th in the world, and it's doubtful that Russia has the short-term economic capacity to absorb such a large chunk of territory and take responsibility for running services. In addition, it was very unlikely that the Ukrainians, having fought the Russians since 2014, they've been engaged in an 8-year war, would ever accept a pro-Russian government. So Russia, at best, would have, even if they decapitated the Zelensky government, they would have had a sort of Afghanistan on their a festering insurgency on their doorstep. So I actually think, if we look at this in the long term, the failure of this bid to build a greater Russia by seizing territory is sobering for countries which may be contemplating similar moves. And it also confirms that the role of great powers overall is declining in the 21st century. And there's been a preoccupation. There was almost a ready acceptance that Russia would quickly overrun Ukraine. They underestimated the resilience of Ukraine. And once again, we've seen, and it's quite a reoccurring pattern in the post-Cold War era since the early 90s, is that a great power's been embarrassed. The United States was embarrassed in Iraq. China's attempt to build artificial islands and win support in its region has backfired. And now we have Russia trying to overrun a neighbouring country, on paper having the firepower to do it, but quite failing in practice. So this is an interesting trend.
So can I ask you then, do you think this will encourage or discourage China and its intentions towards Taiwan, or is China the exception to the rule about the decline of great powers?
When I say decline, I'm talking in relative terms. We've still got a power hierarchy, and some people are more important and influential than others in great power terms, or in terms of state actors. China's position is very interesting, Bruce. Many people interpreted the invasion of Ukraine by Russia as Putin getting the green light from China. But it appears that China's been far more ambiguous about the Russian invasion. And before, there was much attention was drawn to the fact that Putin visited China shortly before the invasion, and the two sides released a long statement in which they spoke about a strategic partnership without limits. Well, we've seen the limits to that partnership. China, despite giving some sort of rhetorical support for Russia's strategic concerns, has effectively rubbished the idea that nuclear weapons could be used in Ukraine. The Chinese were very quick to distance itself when Mr. Lavrov suggested that the conflict might involve nuclear weapons. Secondly, China is very mindful that its rise to superpower status is based on access to the world capitalist market, including big markets in the EU, US and Japan, and they've been very mindful of that. In other words, their support for Russia has been largely symbolic rather than real. They haven't given greatly enhanced economic or military assistance to Russia, so Russia finds itself isolated. So I think this has been sobering for China. And the other thing that China didn't want was the revival of NATO and liberal democracy, which is a trend that we're seeing. Mr. Putin has almost single-handedly revived the idea of liberal democracy and the awfulness of his dictatorial regime has been exposed in the way he's treated, his troops have behaved in Ukraine. And the International Criminal Court is now investigating, as are Ukrainian authorities, the behaviour and the activities of Russia. And so I think all this must be very sobering for China, because both China and Russia were adhering to this narrative before the Ukrainian war about the failing West, and that, you know, liberal democracy was in inherent decline and it would be almost seamlessly displaced by rising authoritarian powers. I think this is a wake-up call. At the end of the day, the West remains very powerful, 60% of the world's economy, and what's more, Western political systems are a lot more popular globally than either the authoritarian model of Mr. Putin or China. So, for China, this must have been quite a sobering experience.
Mm. And Russian President Vladimir Putin, he's been increasingly anti-West, and he's being labelled a war criminal for what's happening in Ukraine. Is this the return of Russia as the global villain?
Let's be quite clear about this. We must distinguish between the Putin regime and Russia. Many Russians, 300,000 of them, fled the country as soon as the invasion began. Many brave Russians have protested. 15,000 Russians have been imprisoned simply for protesting against the war. And by the way, protests include calling this special military operation, which is what Putin calls his invasion. These people have been arrested for up to 15 years for simply calling this special military operation an invasion or a war. So I don't think we should overestimate, and the difficulty of measuring support for the regime in Russia is because it's an authoritarian regime. Can you trust opinion polls when people who are stopped on the street and asked, did they support the president, and they see people jailed for simply calling this military operation or invasion? It's very difficult to know what the level of popular support is. But having made that distinction between Putin regime and Russian people, I think while Putin's in power, Russia will remain a pariah. And I think my own view is that if Russian troops are ejected from Ukraine, which is now the aim of the Ukrainian government, we're in the second phase of the war, with the Russians driven back to the eastern part, if Ukraine, with an increasing infusion of weapons from the West, is able to realise this objective, then I can't see how Putin will politically survive. I mean, one of the biggest disasters for Ukraine, for Putin in recent days, has been the decision of Sweden and Finland to apply for NATO membership. That's going to go down badly, even amongst his supporters, because his whole official rationale for annexing the Ukraine was to prevent its membership of NATO. And yet his action has actually triggered the opposite, which is the expansion of NATO.
And you mentioned the United Nations before. Freedom fighters, they've played a small but important role in this war on both sides. And at the same time, the United Nations has been criticised for a lack of real teeth when it comes to the invasion of one nation by another. In the future, do you think it'll be the United Nations or mercenary armies that keep the peace?
That's a really good question, Bruce. None of us really know the answer, because I think the status of the UN is now up for grabs. I think that it was a fork in the road moment for the UN when Russia just brazenly invaded a neighbouring country, a liberal democracy. This was a senior, if you like, permanent member of the UN and the UN Security Council. It just tore up the UN Charter. It was a blatant and flagrant violation of all the principles that the UN stands for. And of course, President Zelensky quite rightly said, well, how can Russia remain a member of the UN, let alone exercise the veto on resolutions which was denouncing its invasion of Ukraine? So, in short, I think, and President Zelensky has made this quite plain, but when the conflict is over, Ukraine said it reserves the right to demand the reform of the UN Security Council. I was very interested in the different reactions to this. It got little coverage in the United States, which is not particularly keen on reform of the UN. But I think President Zelensky's position has the overwhelming support of the middle powers and the small powers like New Zealand, who have consistently argued it's the veto powers of the Permanent Five which make the UN dysfunctional and irrelevant. After all, this was the very organisation established to maintain security and peace. And yet it was absolutely left as a bystander and impotent as one country simply invaded another. So I think, I'd like to think that a reformed UN could get teeth. I think it was a commentator, or an academic actually, said many years ago, why do wars occur? Because there's nothing there to prevent them. And I think one of the hopes of this terrible conflict, if there's a silver lining, then perhaps the UN will be reformed so it becomes an effective barrier to the sort of aggression that we witnessed at this stage in the 21st century.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.